exploring how the concept of vulnerability, with a particular focus on vulnerability in urban areas. So, Gina, welcome.
Thank you.
And Africa is what people would call an urbanizing continent. Currently, less than half of the population are in urban areas, but by the middle of the century, a large proportion of them are going to be, and probably, actually, I was looking at the figures, an extra 700 million people are going to be living in cities in Africa. So could you sort of explain your understanding of vulnerability and perhaps thinking about this growing urban population, particularly those in informal areas, what that actually means in their context?
So maybe if we go to the definition of vulnerability, thinking about exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So I think one of the things that we see happening in urban areas is that many of these informal settlements are in areas that are particularly exposed. And
so what do you mean by that?
Great, yeah. Yes. So if you think of informal settlements, they're often marginal land. So the land might be often flood prone, as we see in the city of Cape Town. A lot of the informal settlements are in a wetland area, so there's frequent flooding. In some areas there might be frequent landslides, often not very productive soil if people want to engage in agriculture. When I was visiting Accra recently, I saw some fishing populations right on the edge of the coast. That was the only place they had land, but that gave them access to their livelihoods. So high levels of exposure for many of these people in informal settlements. And linked to the exposure is high levels of sensitivity, very sensitive to the impacts of climate. If you go to a shack in the informal settlements in Cape Town, you'll see some of them have water pooling around the shack just even days after the rain has been there. And so it has significant health impacts, and people are sensitive to health impacts. Their livelihoods are sensitive. They might have a small business where things get damaged if there's flooding and their wares are in their house. So a lot of sensitivity to the impacts as well, whether it's health or livelihoods or other physical exposure as well. And then adaptive capacity. Often people living in these areas are struggling to find jobs, have limited resources available to respond, challenges accessing education, accessing information, health clinics, etc.
So in one of my lectures on climate adaptation in the urban setting, I talk about the role of government, city government, in understanding the spatial distribution of risk, so they can then understand where their adaptation hotspots are, for instance, and critically having tools and methods to map out that risk. And there are a number of different approaches to assessing that risk or vulnerability. And I wondered if you could describe a couple of them and their pros and cons.
Sure. So absolutely. I mean, vulnerability assessments are a very important part of understanding who is vulnerable, which areas are vulnerable, and why. And so I think in order to inform your adaptation response, that is important. And there are different ways to do it. Of course, there are ways that are more spatially explicit, and so often those might lend themselves to a quantitative approach to vulnerability assessment through mapping, whether it's through aerial photography, through understanding flood risk on the ground, through understanding land types, etc. And then there are a lot of more qualitative approaches to vulnerability assessment, understanding the lived reality of what it means to live in a flooded settlement, how you were able to cope, who you were able to draw on in those times. And I think both of them have their strengths and weaknesses. And so I think it's very important to use both together. I think sometimes the quantitative ones are presented because they give you nice maps, nice numbers. But if you don't understand what's behind that, it's very hard to intervene meaningfully and adapt in the appropriate way that considers the necessary complexities. Similarly, if you just go in and understand the narratives of a few people and the stories in a certain area, you might not understand the spatial extent of the problem and how it differs over the city.
Or perhaps how vulnerabilities in one place are linked to vulnerabilities in the other, so sort of cascades of connectedness, for instance.
Absolutely. So those interlinkages, and both within the city and to outside of the city. But I think what's interesting is very few cities in Africa have done vulnerability assessments. And so a lot of work has been done in rural areas assessing vulnerability, but limited work has been done across the city scale. So people have often worked, say an NGO has worked in a local community and has done a, say, participatory risk assessment, or they might be mapping across the city of flood risk, but there often isn't a comprehensive vulnerability assessment for the city.
So that's a particular challenge that you think needs to be solved if cities are going to be essentially have the information that they need to be able to figure out what the adaptation priorities might be. Yeah.
Yes and no. So yes, I think it would give a better sense of adaptation priorities, but one of the concerns with vulnerability assessments that has been noted in the literature is that often vulnerability assessments don't lead to adaptation responses. And so people will be part of a vulnerability assessment, they'll be called to a community meeting, we want to know how often has your road been flooded, how often have you had heat waves that you haven't been able to cope with, and then nothing happens to follow up. Yeah. So to me what is important is understanding the nature of vulnerability and understanding how you can respond. And so if there is capacity to do adaptation, then it's really important that the two go together rather than just another stakeholder engagement exercise.
Yep. And one of the interesting quotes that I've come across recently was that the only good policies are ones that can be implemented. And I was actually thinking about this now from the vulnerability perspective and how these two different approaches to vulnerability might actually lead to much better response strategies, because the best technical response is only as good as the local context within which it's being implemented and should actually be defined by that. And is that sort of the example of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And so if you just have a water department that's coming from a very technical aspect, understanding the quantitative nature of flood risk, but not how to implement solutions, you're likely to fail. Yeah. So part of what adaptation is asking us is how do we bring these different actors together to look at it holistically. And so in my view, to do a good adaptation or vulnerability assessment, you need to have a multi-stakeholder transdisciplinary team that's asking questions from different disciplines and from within the academic speciality alongside people on the ground who often have the best insight into understanding local dynamics.
Okay, but if I wanted to push this idea of vulnerability a bit further, which is, do you think that taking this vulnerability perspective actually locks you into almost locks you into the past, in the sense that we have a dynamic world that's changing. We have people with desires and life objectives, and I sometimes feel that vulnerability is around fixing the current situation, not the future, what the future might look like.
So I guess my answer to that would be that you could understand your current vulnerability and try and fix it in terms of the immediate causes of vulnerability, but you can also use an understanding of vulnerability to look at the more structural vulnerability issues. And so to me, if you are drawing on a more holistic understanding of vulnerability and the fact that we have inequalities and unequal access to services, etc., and you try and use that to move into a new future, then it becomes a powerful tool where it can be used for transformation as well, rather than just fixing the current issues. So I think one needs to do two things side by side, which I think is part of the challenge that climate change asks of us, is looking at this long-term nature and into the future, as well as understanding the past.
Because in a lot of African rural contexts, people are maybe stuck into certain livelihood patterns that they would like to move out of, and then so a typical vulnerability assessment say, oh, well, your livestock are vulnerable, and what people actually want to do is become shopkeepers. And so the intervention is to improve livestock, but it's actually not what their desires are pointing them towards.
Absolutely. So to me, one of the promising areas is the field of well-being and trying to understand what people's aspirations are, where they want to go to. And I think that's exactly where you're coming to, is that we need to meet these aspirations, desires of what we want the future to be, as well as understanding the past. And considering these aspirations in the context of a changing climate and changing other things as well. And then take that forward. And so I think often the vulnerability assessments, the way they've been done, haven't been very empowering. And so I think there are a lot of tools that people are starting to use that are more about empowerment, action, aspirations, well-being, that help us to think about a new future. And I think that's really important, but equally really hard to do.
Yeah, adaptation never stops, but actually it's also a process of social development at the same time. So if you think of it in that sense, then you can be progressing towards different futures using adaptation as a tool or a mechanism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to me, that's where you're going to get people interested in being involved in adaptation responses, is if they do help to create a better future, the future that is desired, etc.
Yeah.
So aligning adaptation to climate risk with good development and supporting well-being and what is the kind of life that people want to live is really important to bring those all together.
Gina, thanks very much. You've given us a wonderful sort of insight into the nature of vulnerability, but also the limits of just getting stuck in a vulnerability framing when one's thinking about climate adaptation, and how we can use vulnerability as the starting point for much more progressive and anticipatory thinking that takes people in directions that they want to go, rather than just fixing the situation they're already in.